15 or 16. When I was at the back of the police car, heading to the police station at the moment of my arrest, they asked me how many there were, and I didn't really know. I just gave them a figure. And because I was cooperating with the police, I decided, I'll stick with it, you know. Haul the body out onto the floorboards, put it on the sheet, and then cut it out.
This week, we will be looking into the brutal crimes and the strange motives of the UK's very own Jeffrey Dahmer, Dennis Andrew Nilsen. But how does this story begin? Well, as most, it begins with a birth. Dennis Nilsen was born November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, a bleak and dreary town on the northeast coast of Scotland. His father was a Norwegian soldier who fled his homeland after the German invasion in 1940. It was here that he met a young local girl, Betty White. The couple married shortly after in 1942 and moved into White's family home. Young Betty would find married life to be in stark contrast to the butterflies and fireworks of her courtship. Olav Nilsen, being too focused on his duties with the Free Norwegian Forces and his general flippant attitude towards marriage, made little time to spend with his wife and family. Dennis was the middle child with one older brother and one younger sister. It was after the birth of his younger sister Sylvia that his mother sought a divorce. The family continued to live with Andrew and Lily White, Dennis's grandparents. His grandparents would be the strongest influence on Dennis as a child, what with stern and pious ways. Quote, their Christian faith was so strict that they banned alcohol from the house, and radio and movies were considered to be instruments of the devil, unquote. Dennis had been described as both a sullen and intensely withdrawn and a quiet and adventurous child, depending on the source. What remained consistent, however, is the young boy's bond with his grandfather. Andrew White was a fisherman and, by all accounts, Nilsen's hero. Nilsen could recall early childhood memories of being carried on the shoulders of his grandfather during long countryside walks. The old man would even, quote, regale the little boy with tales of the sea and his ancestors lost beneath its churning waves, unquote. Dennis would look back fondly on his childhood, and when asked of his grandfather's fishing trips, he responded, quote, life would be empty for me until he returned, unquote. Things would not remain sunshine and rainbows, however, for young Dennis. In 1951, while fishing in the North Sea, Dennis's grandfather died of a heart attack. His body was returned to the shore and to the family home before burial. It was then that Dennis saw his first dead body, and Nigel Cawthorne, author of Serial Killers and Mass Murderers, Profiles of the World's Most Barbaric Criminals, states that, quote, the images of death and love were fused in Dennis's mind, unquote. It was perhaps after his grandfather's death that Dennis became more withdrawn. He would spend much of his time alone. He withdrew from family activities and spent much of his alone time by the beach. It was during one such trip, around 1954-55, that Nilsen himself nearly drowned. He would later say that at first he panicked, as one would in the situation, and, quote, gasped for air which wasn't there. But amidst the struggle, he had a brief moment of tranquility, believing that his grandfather was about to arrive and pull him out. It was not his grandfather, however, that saved him, but instead another young man who dragged him to shore. It was during puberty that things started to radically change for Dennis. It was at this time that he realized that he was in fact homosexual, a fact that was both confusing and shameful for the young man. But don't get too sympathetic. Because many of the boys to whom he was attracted had similar facial features as his sister, he molested young Sylvia, quote, believing that his attraction towards boys might be a manifestation of the care he felt for her, unquote. He would even caress and fondle his older brother while he slept. At 15, Nilsen left school and joined the army. He intended to train as a chef, and it was during his 11-year stint that he learned how to sharpen knives and how to dissect a carcass. It was also in the army that Nilsen's sexual proclivities seemed to escalate. While he kept his sexual orientation hidden from his colleagues, that didn't stop him from including them in his twisted fantasies. often having them pose as soldiers killed in battle to pleasure himself with later. That's just the tip of the iceberg, however. When Nilsen would drink with his peers, he'd also pretend to be drunk with the hope that someone would, quote, make sexual use of his unconscious body, unquote. Something strange did happen to Dennis, however, when he was enlisted. While stationed in the state of Aden, Nilsen was kidnapped by a taxi driver. This was not uncommon, as Dennis would later tell of his regiment losing several men in ambushes much like this while on their way back to the barracks. The taxi driver beat him and placed his unconscious form in the trunk of his taxi. When the taxi driver went to pull him out of the trunk, Nilsen grabbed a jack handle and proceeded to beat the taxi driver unconscious. This may have been Nilsen's first murder, as he never knew if the man survived the assault or not. After 11 years, Nilsen left the army and decided to join the Metropolitan Police Force. As Nigel Cawthorne puts it, quote, Nilsen did well on the police force, but his private life was gradually disintegrating. Death became an obsession. He would pretend to be a corpse himself, masturbating in front of a mirror with blue paint smeared on his lips and his skin whitened with talcum powder, unquote. He would not stay on the police force for long. Only 11 months into his career as a cop, Nilsen decided to resign because he caught two men, quote, committing an act of gross indecency in a parked car and could not bring himself to arrest them. After his resignation, he went to work as a civil servant, eventually being promoted to an executive officer at the job centre in Kentish Town, North London. In November of 1975, while living in Teignmouth Road in Cricklewood, Dennis met David Gallichan. The pair met when Dennis broke up a fight between Gallichan and some others outside of a pub. When the fight was broken up, Dennis convinced Gallichan to come back to his place, where the two got very drunk, and Dennis learned that, quote, Gallichan had recently moved to London, was homosexual, was unemployed, and resided in a hostel, unquote. The next morning, the two decided to move in with each other, eventually moving into 195 Melrose Avenue with a part of Nilsen's inheritance and their new dog named Blip. The deal was sealed with an exclusive use of the backyard garden. That detail will become important later on. While Dennis was the main breadwinner of the pair and Gallichan focused on decorating the flat, the two were in companionable contentment until Nilsen's abusive side surfaced. Gallichan was verbally berated and often suffered due to Dennis's short temper. Things came to a head in May of 1977 when the two had a very bad fight. While Nilsen claims he told Gallichan to leave, the latter claims that it was his decision because he couldn't take the verbal abuse any longer.
I can't understand you. I ask you to start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go sit, pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like. They're training chimpanzees at Cape Canaveral to operate a camera. Anybody can do it. Batteries have run out. That's why the camera went up the creek. Okay, fair enough. If you think you know how to use it, all you do is point it down and press a button. What are you doing switching the bloody thing on and off for? You'd never make a cameraman, you know. No. I'm not going to do anything pornographic. Harassed commuter. Harassed London tenant being screwed by the Department of Employment. London Transport. Big chain stores, supermarkets. Can you, cut there, let me think. Beer I cannot stand, I got it for free at the bottle party.
At 195 Melrose Avenue, Nilsen had found a home, but also found himself increasingly lonely after his falling out with and the departure of his former roommate and lover. The fleeting casual relationships and one-night stands with various young men seemed to only deepen the ache that Nilsen longed to fill with the presence of a steady partner and lover. None of his relationships after Gallichan lasted for more than 3 weeks, though, and Nilsen would ultimately conclude that he was, quote, unfit to live with, and began a solitary existence, drinking at home alone while listening to his music. Perhaps it was this increased sense of isolation, paired with Nilsen's inherent sociopathic tendencies, that drove him to commit his first murder. On December 30th, 1978, Dennis Nilsen had been drinking heavily during the day at home, but around evening time decided that he must go out at all costs to seek company from the outside world. He wandered into the Cricklewood Arms pub, where he would encounter 14-year-old Stephen Holmes, who had been on his way home from a concert and had unsuccessfully tried to purchase alcohol and been rebuffed. Nilsen would invite Holmes, who he believed to be 17, back to his flat with the promise of drinking and listening to music. They would do just that, the pair drinking very heavily before falling asleep. In the morning, Nilsen would wake to find Holmes sound asleep in his bed. He was reluctant to rouse the youth since he was, in his own words in a subsequent confession, quote, "afraid to wake him in case he left me," unquote. It was then and there that Nilsen decided that Stephen Holmes would, quote, "stay with me over the new year whether he wanted to or not," unquote. His fear of abandonment and a dark need to take a new sort of flatmate would take over as Nilsen would take a necktie and strangle Holmes before ultimately drowning him in a bucket of water. In a bizarre ritual that would follow with many of his victims, Nilsen then took the body to the bathroom and washed it thoroughly. He then placed it back in his bed and would later remark that he found the corpse beautiful. He unsuccessfully attempted sex with the dead young man, instead masturbating over the body twice before he would spend the night sleeping next to it. Nilsen would then hide the corpse beneath the floorboards for about 7 months before removing it and burning the remains in a bonfire in his back garden on August 11, 1979. Once the murder switch had been flipped in Nilsen's brain, there seemed to be no shutting it off. Past the point of no return, he recalled, quote, "I caused dreams which caused death. That is my crime," unquote. On October 11, 1979, Nilsen would make an attempt at a second murder, though this one wouldn't go entirely as planned. He met student Andrew Ho at the St. Martin's Lane pub. He would lure Ho back to his apartment with the promise of sex. When they got there, Nilsen would attempt to strangle Ho, who, luckily for him, managed to escape and flee, and reported the incident to police. Nilsen was questioned by the police, but ultimately would be dropped as a suspect because Ho refused to press charges. A close call where Nilsen could have been stopped, but unfortunately for his next victim, was not. 2 months later, on December 3, 1979, Nilsen would encounter 23-year-old Canadian student Kenneth Ockenden, where he seemed to meet most of his victims, at a pub. Ockenden had been in England visiting some relatives, and when Nilsen discovered that the young man was playing tourist, he offered to show Ockenden several London landmarks. After a day of sightseeing, Nilsen invited Ockenden back to his flat for dinner and drinks. Nilsen would again succumb to his fears of abandonment, and while he was adamant that he did not recall the moment he strangled the young tourist, but did recall that he did the deed with the cord of the headphones on which Ockenden was listening to music. He would then drag the body across the floor by the cord and pour himself a glass of rum before continuing to listen to music himself on the very same set of headphones he had just used to end Kenneth Ockenden's life. He would wash the body as he did with the first victim, spending the night beside it. The next day, Nilsen would purchase a Polaroid camera and take snapshots of Ockenden's body in suggestive poses. He would engage in sex with the corpse, laying it spread-eagled above him on the bed before wrapping the body in plastic bags and stowing it beneath the floorboards like he had Stephen Holmes. Though uniquely this time, on 4 separate occasions over the next 2 weeks after the murder, Nilsen would disinter Ockenden's body and would prop it up in a chair beside him, having conversations with it while watching television and drinking. On May 17, 1980, Nilsen would claim his third victim, 16-year-old runaway Martin Duffy. Duffy had hitchhiked to London on May 13th without his parents' knowledge and had been on the streets, sleeping rough in train stations and the like when Nilsen encountered him upon returning from a union conference in Southport. Nilsen recalled that Duffy was exhausted and starving, so he readily took him up on an offer of a warm meal and a place to sleep for the night. Once Duffy had fallen asleep in Nilsen's bed, Nilsen took the opportunity to fashion a ligature and sit on Duffy's chest, pulling the ligature with great force. Duffy would slip into unconsciousness and would be dragged to the kitchen, where Nilsen would finish off the youth by drowning him in the sink. He would wash the body with care as he did with his other victims, recalling that it was, quote, "the youngest looking I had ever seen," unquote. Yuck. Duffy's body was placed in a chair, then moved back to Nilsen's bed, where he would kiss and caress the corpse, complimenting it both before and after masturbating while sitting on the corpse's chest. Duffy's body would be stored in a cupboard before decay and bloating from putrefaction would force Nilsen to stow the body under the floorboards alongside Kenneth Ockenden. After Duffy's murder, the killings would increase in frequency. By the end of 1980, he would murder 5 more and attempt to kill another, but only one of those 5 that were killed during that time, Billy Sutherland, has ever been positively identified. He followed Nilsen home one unfortunate night and met the same fate as the men before him that dared step foot into the flat on Melrose. By then, the foul odors and swarms of insects drawn by the corpses beneath the floorboards were becoming hard to ignore. Nilsen would report that the bodies were polluted with maggots and fly pupae that would ooze out of the eye sockets when he attempted to disinter them, like some kind of nightmarish Cronenberg-style piñata. He would place deodorants under the house in the makeshift graves and would spray insecticides twice a week to attempt to keep the insect infestation under control, but the stink of rot and decay remained. Finally, having no further recourse and not wanting to draw unwanted attention from any authorities, in late 1980 Nilsen would remove and dismember each victim killed since December of 1979. He would throw the remains on a bonfire he had erected in an empty spot behind his lot. In order to disguise the distinct smell of burning flesh, Nilsen placed a tire on top of the raging fire to burn, choking the air with acrid black smoke. Once the fire had burned down to nothing but ashes and cinders, Nilsen would use a rake to go through the remnants, seeking any recognizable bits left behind. Upon finding a skull still intact, Nilsen would destroy it by smashing it to pieces with his rake. Between January and April of 1981, Nilsen would lure 3 more young men back to his apartment, where they would never be seen alive again. These 3 remain unidentified, only known by their descriptions and subsequent confessions by Nilsen. Quote, an 18-year-old blue-eyed Scot, an English skinhead, and a Belfast boy. The final victim known to be claimed at Melrose Avenue, 24-year-old Malcolm Barlow, would be taken September 17, 1981. Barlow would be found slumped against a wall outside of his home by Nilsen, and when Nilsen inquired on the welfare of the young man, he would be informed that the medication that Barlow took for his epilepsy had caused his legs to be weak. Nilsen recommended that Barlow should be in the hospital and helped him into his residence before calling an ambulance. The next day, Barlow would be released from the hospital and would return to Nilsen's home in order to thank his generous rescuer for his assistance. Nilsen invited him in, and after a meal and a rum and a coke, Barlow would fall asleep on the sofa. Nilsen would manually strangle Barlow where he rested on the couch and stow his body beneath the kitchen sink the next morning. So much for being a generous savior. In mid-1981, Nilsen's landlord decided to renovate the property at Melrose and asked Nilsen to vacate. While initially resistant to do so, Nilsen was eventually persuaded by the offer of cold hard cash in the form of £1,000. Before leaving, though, he would construct another impromptu funeral pyre behind his home, where he would incinerate the remains of the last 5 victims killed at this address, again masking the crematory fumes by adding an old tire to the bonfire. When Nilsen moved to his attic apartment at 23 Cranley Gardens, he lost access to a garden and floorboards to dispose of his victims' bodies. He had to find a new, creative way to get rid of the bodies, which we will get into a little bit later. First, let's talk about John Howlett. Nilsen met Howlett, 23, while drinking at a pub near Leicester Square. He was able to lure the male back to his place under the pretense that there would be more drinking. The two would watch a film before Howlett, blitzed and drowsy, went to the front room to get some sleep. Nilsen tried to wake up Howlett, eventually giving up, before deciding to sit and watch the man sleep while he himself drank some more rum. It was during this weird voyeuristic situation that Nilsen decided to kill Howlett. He tried to strangle Howlett, but there was a struggle. This was the first time that a victim had fought back and attempted to strangle Nilsen in return. Shaken and unnerved, it took Nilsen 3 attempts at strangling Howlett with an upholstery strap, and failing to complete the deed before he decided to drown him in the bathtub. The next victim, Carl Stoddard, age 21, met Nilsen in May of 1982 at the Black Cat pub in Camden. As they talked and drank their sorrows away, Nilsen learned that Stoddard was depressed from a failed relationship. Doing what any good stranger does, Nilsen lured Stoddard to his place with the promise of more alcohol. Like Howlett, Stoddard had fallen asleep at Nilsen's, but woken up to Nilsen strangling him and whispering, "Stay still." Nilsen soon stopped when he realized that Stoddard was awake, and Stoddard, to his poor unfortunate credit, thought Nilsen was just freeing him from his sleeping bag and went back to sleep. He awoke again to the sound of running water. He'd later recall that he couldn't remember much except being immersed in the water and pleading, quote, "No more, please, no more." That was it. Another victim down just like the rest. Or so one would think. Nilsen, believing Stoddard to be dead, brought him back to his bed, only to realize that the boy was still alive when his dog Blip began licking Stoddard's face and it twitched. He began to rub circulation back into Stoddard's limbs to revive him, and later, when questioned about what he'd experienced, Nilsen told Stoddard that he got stuck in the zip of his sleeping bag after a nightmare. He also said he placed Stoddard in the cold water as the man was in shock. Stoddard stayed with Nilsen for 2 days to recuperate before Nilsen took him to the train station, wished him well, and hoped they'd cross paths again in the future. Luckily for Carl Stoddard, that only happened in a courtroom. Nilsen met Graham Allen, 27, when Allen was attempting to hail a cab. Dennis offered to accompany him and invited him back to his place for a meal. When asked about Allen's murder, Nilsen could not recall the time, but remembered approaching him as he ate an omelet with full intent to murder. He kept Graham's body for 3 days before dissecting it on the kitchen floor, bagging limbs and body parts together, separate from the entrails and internal organs. Stephen Sinclair was Nilsen's final victim. Stephen, age 20, met Nilsen on January 26, 1983. Much like the others, he was invited back to Nilsen's place and fell asleep in a drug and alcohol-induced stupor while listening to music through headphones. Nilsen is known to have said, quote, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again," before strangling him with a ligature made from a necktie and a rope. When performing the ritual cleansing of the body, Nilsen discovered deep slashes on Stephen's wrists where he'd attempted to take his own life. After the cleaning, Nilsen covered the body in talcum and arranged 3 mirrors around the bed. He lay naked beside Sinclair, kissed him on the forehead, and said goodnight. Over the next few days, he dissected Sinclair's body and used the same crepe bandages that were on Stephen's wrists to seal the bags. It was at this point that Nilsen would boil the flesh off the heads, hands, and feet of his victims, much like he did back during his Melrose Avenue days. He began to dispose of the flesh, internal organs, and small bones by flushing them down the toilet. Incredibly smart, or a fatal flaw? Let's get into that.
Funny enough, in a dead body, there's no blood spurts or anything like that. It congeals inside and forms part of the flesh in there, and it becomes like anything in a butcher's shop. There's little or no blood. You know these plastic bags that you have, dustbin liner, you slit one of those so it forms a kind of a sheet. You haul the body out onto the floorboards, put it on the sheet, and then cut it out.
In an unlikely twist of fate that Nilsen either never predicted or he himself ironically set into motion, the crimes at Cranley Gardens were discovered by a plumber. Yes, you heard that right. A plumber discovered a serial killer before the cops did. Michael Catran, a Dino Rod employee, was responding to the flats at Cranley Gardens following complaints by several tenants and Nilsen himself about a drain blockage. Upon opening a drain cover on the side of the house, Catran discovered what the blockage that was slowing the drains was. The drain was packed with what appeared to be a flesh-like substance and numerous small bones of undetermined origin. Catran was immediately suspicious, as any sane person might be. Red flags were flying all over the place, so he reported his findings directly to his supervisor, and both would return to the house after dusk and agree to hold off on any further investigation of the blockage until the next morning. Prior to leaving the property, Catran was stopped by Dennis Nilsen and a fellow tenant, David Alcock, to ask what the source of the blockage had been. After declaring how similar the strange blockage was to human flesh, Nilsen would remark to Catran that, quote, "It looks to me like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken," unquote. Big difference between the Colonel and a Colonel, Dennis. Big. Huge. Dennis was likely aware by now that he'd have some quick explaining to do by the time the morning came, and that he was likely about to be caught. So he attempted to cover his tracks quickly by going to the drain himself late at night and clearing the flesh and bone. He was spotted by a fellow tenant during his last-ditch cleaning efforts, who immediately became suspicious of Nilsen's actions. When Catran and his supervisor returned in the morning to find a suddenly unblocked drain, they were understandably incredibly suspicious. More red flags. Upon further inspection, Catran would find scraps of flesh and more scattered bones in a pipe leading from the drain to the uppermost apartment in the house. You can guess who lived in that one. The plumbers immediately called the police, thinking the remains looked as though they had once been parts of a human hand. The remains were taken to a mortuary and were identified by pathology professor David Bowen as, indeed, human. Even further and more disturbing, he identified one of the scraps of flesh as possibly being from a neck, with ligature marks still intact. This same morning, Nilsen reportedly told a work colleague laughingly that, quote, "If I'm not in tomorrow, I'll either be ill, dead, or in jail," unquote. On the evening of the 9th of February, police would wait for Nilsen to return from work in order to question him about the remains that were found in the drain leading from his residence. 3 officers would follow Nilsen into his apartment, where they immediately caught the scent of rotting flesh. Nilsen would ask the police why they were so interested in his drains, and when the police revealed that they had discovered the offending blockage had been human remains, Nilsen would feign shock, saying, quote, "Good grief, how awful." But Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. was not exactly in the mood for jokes. He responded to Nilsen by saying curtly, quote, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" To which Dennis denied up and down, saying he didn't know anything, claimed innocence. No. Dennis Nilsen did none of those things. Instead, he would calmly point to 2 trash bags in a nearby wardrobe, saying that the rest of the body in question could be found there. DCI J would ask Nilsen if any more remains were to be found on the property, to which Nilsen replied, quote, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest. Not here, at the police station." Unquote. He was then placed under arrest for suspicion of murder. When asked whether the remains found in the bags belonged to one person or more, Nilsen calmly replied while staring out the window of the police car, quote, 15 or 16 since 1978, unquote. So much for an elaborate game of cat and mouse. The bags were later removed by authorities from the Cranley Gardens apartment, and their contents were as nightmarish as could be expected. One contained 2 dissected torsos and a shopping bag of various internal organs. The second bag contained a human skull, mostly flensed and peeled of flesh, another severed head, and a torso with arms attached, but the hands absent. In an interview conducted on February 10th, Nilsen would confess to further human remains being inside a tea chest in the apartment, as well as an upturned drawer in the bathroom. The remains were from the final 3 victims taken at the Cranley Gardens horror house. More bones and sections of corpses, including a skull, the lower part of a torso, and some legs, would be found exactly where Nilsen claimed they would be. The same day, he would escort the police to his former home at Melrose Avenue, where he would show them the locations of his funeral bonfires where he had disposed of his previous victims. Once charged with murder, Nilsen would be interviewed on 16 separate occasions over the following days, where he would confess in elaborate and excruciating detail to his murders, totaling over 30 hours of audio tape. He was adamant when he said he didn't know why he killed, simply responding, quote, "I was hoping you will tell me that." And when asked about his motives, he would speak in detail of how he would clean the bodies after killing them via strangulation or drowning. He would apply makeup to cover any of the blemishes or signs of decay or as long as possible after death. He would dress them, prop them up, engage them in conversations, or simply for company. He would indulge his sexual impulses with the bodies, either through masturbating over them or through intercrural sex, but insisted that he never penetrated any of the victims, claiming that they were, quote, "too perfect and beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex." He was asked why some of the heads discovered in the Cranley Gardens apartment had been exposed to moist heat, and Nilsen simply explained how he had boiled the heads to rid them of the internal contents and the flesh. He would dissect the rest of the bodies and wrap larger parts in plastic bags. Smaller parts and scraps of flesh and internal organs he would flush down the toilet, which ultimately led to his arrest. He said it was the only method he could come up with in order to dispose of the remains, seeing as how he had no garden in which to incinerate them at Cranley. He claimed to take no joy from the act of killing, but he, quote, worshipped the act and art of death. He spoke of keeping victims under the floorboards at Melrose and how he had burned the remains once they had become putrefied, and the smell and the amount of insects they were attracting was becoming concerning. He would speak of how difficult dissecting the decomposing bodies was, how he would have to steel his nerves with whiskey before doing the deed and still being revulsed, and how he would often vomit. Dennis Nilsen was asked if he had any remorse for his crimes, to which he only dubiously replied, quote, I wish I could stop, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness, unquote. Dennis Nilsen was brought to trial on October 24, 1983. He was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Nilsen pleaded not guilty to all charges, while the defense and prosecution engaged in a battle over his sanity. Defense lawyer Ivan Lawrence posited that, quote, Nilsen suffered from diminished responsibility, rendering him incapable of forming the actual intention to commit murder, and should therefore be convicted of manslaughter as opposed to murder, unquote. Dennis had cooperated with the police, providing a full detailed confession, which led to the discovery of the charred bone fragments of 12 victims from Melrose Avenue, in addition to the dismembered bodies at Cranley Gardens. The nail in the coffin was Nilsen's own admission, quote, at the precise moment of the act of murder, I believe I am right in doing the act, unquote. So while Nilsen was mentally abnormal, he was still sane and had to take responsibility for the killings. Douglas Stewart was the first to testify against Nilsen. He stated he'd woken up in Nilsen's apartment with his ankles bound. Nilsen was straddling Stewart and strangling him. When overpowered, Nilsen shouted, take my money, which the prosecution argued reflected Nilsen's, quote, rational, cool presence of mind in that he hoped to be overheard by the other tenants. Stewart had reported the incident to police, but after questioning Nilsen as well, the police dismissed the ordeal as just a lover's quarrel. The second witness was Paul Nobbs. He testified that he went with Nilsen back to the Cranley Gardens apartment for some drinks. Nobbs woke up in the morning with a terrible headache, eyes bloodshot, and face completely red. Clearly, he'd been strangled in his sleep, but Nilsen had been able to control himself enough not to kill the young man. Nobbs had not reported the attack to the police for fear of being outed as gay. Carl Stoddard also testified against Nilsen, recounting his strangling and near drowning. However, the evidence he provided was not added to the indictment against Nilsen because his whereabouts were unknown until after the indictment was completed. That should be enough to convict, right? The witness statements, the physical evidence, Nilsen's cooperation. He even said, quote, I have no tears for my victims, I have no tears for myself, nor those bereaved by my actions, unquote. That alone should be enough to convict, right? The witness statements, the physical evidence, Nilsen's own cooperation. He even said himself, quote, I have no tears for my victims, I have no tears for myself, nor those bereaved by my actions, unquote. That should have been irrefutable, but let's at least entertain what the defense's 2 psychiatrists said about Nilsen. First up was Dr. James McKeith. He testified to a lack of emotional development that led Nilsen to have difficulty expressing any other emotion besides anger, and to treat other people as, quote, components of his fantasies. He also claimed that because Nilsen was narcissistic, he had an impaired sense of identity and could depersonalize other people. Due to this unspecified personality disorder, Nilsen had diminished responsibility. Second to testify was Dr. Patrick Galway. He diagnosed Nilsen with a, quote, borderline false self as if pseudo-normal narcissistic personality disorder with occasional outbreaks of schizoid disturbances. Basically, he was narcissistic and at least partly schizophrenic. He argued that during these instances, Nilsen would act impulsive and violent and would, quote, disintegrate under the circumstances of social isolation. The prosecution, however, was able to get Galway to admit that Nilsen was intellectually aware of his actions. To rebut the claims made by the defense's psychiatrist, the prosecution called Dr. Paul Bowden. Paul had interviewed Nilsen 16 times for a total of 14 hours. He testified that although Nilsen was abnormal in a colloquial sense, possibly the understatement of the century, that he was a manipulative person capable of forming relationships but had, quote, forced himself to objectify people. He also testified that Nilsen did not have a mental disorder. The jury adjourned to consider their verdict on November 3rd and returned the next day, finding Nilsen guilty on all counts. Nilsen was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years. Dennis Nilsen would be interviewed at length by television news outlets and the media many times during his time in prison. He would even be asked about the Milwaukee monster, Jeffrey Dahmer, whose motives and kill count were very similar to Nilsen's. When asked if he thought Dahmer did indeed cannibalize his victims, as was claimed, a claim which Nilsen would refute, he would say that likely Dahmer did not consume the flesh of his victims, but that it was simply for the purposes of easier disposal of material that could rot and draw attention, as Nilsen himself had done. In an interview with true crime writer Brian Masters for Vanity Fair, Masters would cite one of his interviews with Nilsen, quote, "It is Nilsen's opinion that claims of Dahmer's cannibalism are probably not true. He is talking subconsciously," Nilsen told me in our recent interview. "It's a kind of wishful thinking. What he really wants is spiritual ingestion, to take the essence of the person into himself and thereby feel bigger. It's almost a paternal thing in an odd way." Significantly, Milwaukee Police Chief Philip Areola told the Milwaukee Journal early in the investigation that the evidence is not consistent with cannibalism, implying that none of the body parts which littered the apartment supported Dahmer's contention. Somewhat tentatively, I asked Nilsen if he'd ever been tempted to eat parts of his victims. As usual, he used his strange brand of humor to disguise an unpleasant subject. "Oh, never," he replied. "I'm strictly a bacon and eggs man." Unquote. And it was not until 2006 that Nilsen's first victim would be ultimately identified as Stephen Holmes, and to this day, at least 4 victims from the Melrose Avenue crimes remain unidentified. Authorities remain hopeful that future scientific analysis, as well as advancements in DNA and genetic information gathering, may one day shed light on the identities of these lost individuals and give them final rest. Nilsen would remain serving out his life sentence until May 18, 2018. 2 days earlier, the 71-year-old had been taken to the hospital suffering from abdominal pains. He received an operation to relieve the discomfort, but would suffer a blood clot after surgery. He would lay in excruciating pain and his own filth for 2 hours before finally expiring from a ruptured abdominal aneurysm. His official cause of death was listed as a pulmonary embolism and a retroperitoneal hemorrhage linked to the aneurysm. And ultimately, it couldn't have happened to a more worthy person.